There are a lot of reasons why people do feel benefits on these diets and feel better in some ways, but there are also a lot of drawbacks, especially in the long term. So let's talk about some of those differences and why some people might feel better when they transition towards this type of diet, and then the cost of being on a diet like this.
Yeah. I mean, I guess a good example to use to start is the Petersons, and specifically Michaela Peterson, to talk about one of the main benefits of the diet. And if anyone's not aware of her situation, I'm pretty sure she had an autoimmune arthritis disease that led to the replacement of multiple joints. I think it was ankle and hip, and I'm not sure of her specifics. But in talking about that, one of the primary benefits of carnivore or low carb or keto or anything like that starting out is that it has it changes gut health or gut function and things along those lines. And just by getting rid of grains and getting rid of fermentable carbohydrates and different things like that, in the presence of a colonic dysbiosis or small bowel overgrowth of microorganisms, can cause huge benefits for people who are suffering from those. And I think that a lot of people are finding that they have issues with their microbiome and things like that. And that actually is talking point in paleo. One of the main talking points of paleo for a while was gut health, with a focus on fixing gut health and bone broth and all these different things to sort of move gut health in the right way. So with carnivore, this first primary benefit is that when you just go to only eat meat is fully digested, mainly in the small intestine. It's not really fermentable unless you have a lot of I would say like connective tissue, cartilaginous tissue from the meat. So if you're eating like different joints, but just eating steaks or ribeyes, it's mostly protein that's easily digested and absorbed in the small intestine. And it doesn't leave a lot of residue to go be fermented in the colon. So if you do have a dysbiosis present in the colon, you do have some pathogenic bacterial strains. For example, Klebsiella pneumonia is associated with Crohn's disease and ankylosing spondylitis. And then different types of bacteria and different microorganisms are associated also with different types of autoimmune diseases like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease and rheumatoid arthritis and things like that. So if you're not feeding those bacteria in the gut with a lot of fermentable carbohydrates, which is the main substrate that they're going to feed off of, then you can effectively get rid of symptoms. And a lot of people notice that they get rid of a lot of symptoms, or they reverse autoimmune diseases when they go on these diets. And I think it's because of the lack of feeding a dysbiotic bowel. So the question is in this scenario, is it really healing the person when they go on these diets, or are they just getting rid of, and say they are getting rid of symptoms, they don't have all these bacterial products being formed from the fermentation of these carbs in their colon, or if they have a small bowel overgrowth in their small intestine, they may have some healing, but does it solve the underlying issue of the dysbiosis?
Yeah, I just want to summarize what you were saying for gut health, which is basically that if you don't have good gut health, if the bacteria and other microbes like fungi in your intestine, you have different overgrowths, or if the quote unquote bad bacteria you have excessive amounts of them. If your gut health is not good, then it can be pretty difficult to eat carbohydrates because a lot of them will feed whatever bad microbes are in there, which produce a lot of gut toxins, which are disastrous for our health. They're in every way. And so you were saying that that a lot of people's symptoms, whether it's autoimmune conditions or joint pain or weight gain or insulin resistance, can come back to this sort of gut health. And when we go to a low carb diet, whether it's carnivore or primal or some other offshoot, it can lead to relief from those symptoms because you're not feeding this dysbiosis in your gut.
I think it's important to point out too, it's a lot of the studies look at specific strains of bacteria or fungi or parasites and whatnot in the GI tract, and they can have a lot of issues. They can cause a lot of issues individually, but a lot of times it's an ecological thing. So it's a lot of different species of bacteria and fungi and parasites together in sort of, and that's why they call it a dysbiosis rather than just purely an infection.
Sure.
And that's because it's multiple different things going wrong simultaneously. And it is caused by diet. It is caused by diet. And then the other thing that is a main cause of this, and that's at least as theorized in the literature, is lack of breastfeeding and being formula fed and things like that, setting you up for a ton of issues going forward. So considering the state of most modern people being formula fed, not being breastfed, and then growing up on diets that have a lot of potential to cause dysbiosis in the bowel, it's not surprising that these carnivore diets with lack of fermentable carbs are actually helping people. I mean, neither of us is really arguing that getting rid of some of these things isn't helpful. I mean, I think it is helpful. I think that maybe going down to a diet that's extremely or less irritating overall is really helpful for a period of time for people. So it's not that we're saying it's terrible. These benefits are legit. It's just that it may not be the best long-term option. So
yeah, it comes at a cost.
Yeah, it comes at a cost. And as I was saying before, there's some other irritating compounds, and this is one of the other things they talk about. And this goes hand in hand with the dysbiosis as well, because a lot of the irritating compounds, like one of the ones they talk about in the gut is oxalates, which can be found in sweet potatoes. It can be found in specifically in spinach and chard. A lot of those plant foods can actually cause irritation in the gut if you don't have certain species present to break down the oxalates, and if your gut barrier or your gut integrity isn't doing so hot. So there's tons of different compounds in plants. You have oxalates, you have lectins, which are like protein carbohydrate combinations that bind to the intestinal wall and the intestinal lining and can strip it, and then they can interact with the immune system. And tons of different plants have lectins. I think almost every single plant has lectins. Animal foods also are loaded with lectins as well, and they have all different effects. It's not that lectins as a whole are terrible. It's just that different ones have different effects and meant for a particular reason. And so these different foods can cause a lot of irritation, especially if you have a dysbiosis, and then especially if your gut integrity is poor. And so the getting rid of these foods for a period of time can essentially allow the gut to rest of sorts, and allow it to not be under a constant assault, especially because some foods that are considered health foods currently are some of the biggest contributors to causing gut issues, including whole grains and including legumes for certain people. And then some of the vegetables and things like that are actually very irritating for people. And then the last part that goes with this is there's a strong focus in the carnivore diet on having easily absorbable and highly nutritious foods. And that is definitely a benefit, especially if you're including dairy in the diet and you're tolerating dairy. Then the combination of just milk and meat, and then organ meats and fats from these animals, or if you're eating eggs in the diet, that's a very nutritious diet in and of itself, and covers a lot of bases that aren't met when you're coming from a standard American diet, especially. And even when people go on keto diets, I mean, the keto diet, it does include plant foods, but often the plant foods are like green vegetables and things like that, which are very nutrient dense. And then they also have the high amount of animal foods that are nutrient dense. So you get a complete diet coming, and this is especially when you're coming from something where you have a heavy wheat-based diet. It's processed. It's from genetically modified monoculture crops with poor soil nutrients and things like that. And then you're eating just factory farmed chicken breasts. Because, I mean, the main diet, there was an article that looked at this over the 100 years looking at the American diet. There's a decrease in consumption of beef and pork and things like that. I think it was mainly beef, and then there's a decrease in dairy. And then there's an increase in consumption of chicken and vegetable oil. And then grains even dropped a little bit as well. So the diet, but refined sugar increased to some extent as well. So the diet really shifted to be less nutrient dense. And so just going from standard American to going to keto is beneficial, even if you don't have the carbs. Or if you're going to paleo and you do, but you're low carb and you have carbs, or even if you're going carnivore if you have a serious issue, because you increase nutrients, you get rid of things that are irritating. And then one of the biggest ones is not feeding the dysbiosis. And I just one thing I really want to point out about the dysbiosis, just so that we can solidify what it actually is when you have certain carbohydrate foods. So certain carbohydrate foods are almost entirely absorbed in the small intestine. And these would be things like white rice, especially if it's not cooled, where it can produce resistant starch, and then juices that have a specific ratio of glucose to fructose. But a lot of other fruits or vegetables or even grains and things like that have carbohydrates that make it to the colon, and these can feed these different populations of bacteria. And so when they feed these populations of bacteria, if they are pathogenic bacteria or there's a dysbiosis, then essentially what you'll see is you have a dissolving of the mucus layer in the colon and then a breakdown of gut integrity. And then you'll have a release of toxic compounds from these bacteria. And the main one that they talk about in the research is endotoxin, which comes from gram-negative bacteria. But there's a whole host of compounds that can be released by these bacteria, and it causes immune activation. And a lot of autoimmune disease are postulated to be related to a chronic infection in the gut from some of these bacteria with consistent immune activation. So it's really important that we keep the gut sealed and that we don't have a dysbiotic bowel or a chronic infection in the colon or anything like that. And I think that is one of the primary benefits that a lot of people are seeing, specifically with the autoimmune component, especially in somebody like Michaela Peterson's case for carnivore diets.
Yeah, and it goes beyond just immune activity. The reason for that is because these toxins produced from the gut directly interfere with our ability to produce energy on the mitochondrial level. And that directly causes inflammation, which leads to these sorts of autoimmune states, this stress state. And so removing those things leads to a lot of relief there.
Yeah.
And I would say that this is one of the main things that inhibits our ability to produce energy, which is really the foundational component to our health, which we'll briefly touch on. But yeah, that was a good summary. We have had a few episodes talking specifically about gut health in more detail, how different foods interact with our gut, which ones are ideal. And so I'll link to those. But yeah, so the point being there that there are several important, significant benefits from removing carbs from the diet, whether it's a low carb or keto or carnivore. And sometimes, especially with something like carnivore, because even if you have some of those leafy greens in your diet and you're just doing low carb or you're doing keto, and you have some other vegetation in your diet, for people who are even more sensitive, those things can still be irritating. So The point being that the main benefits from the carnivore raw primal diets are nutrient density and a relief from inflammation and gut and health disrupting factors from our gut. So those are kind of the most important things, and they are benefits, but they come at a pretty big cost. And again, this is in many ways much better than the conventional diets, because the types of carbohydrates that most people are eating are grains, or and typically improperly prepared grains, unripe fruit, a lot of
processed foods.
That's
a huge one.
Right. And so these come with a lot of problems that are separate from the carbohydrates themselves. And when you're in the low carb community, there is this grouping of all carbohydrates as being the same. And because of that, all carbohydrates are not only not ideal, they're like the worst thing as far as health is concerned. But in reality, in the same, we talked about, these diets being pretty nutrient dense. There's a huge nutrient that they're missing out on, and that is carbohydrates. Yeah. And we've talked about this in detail in several episodes, so I'm not going to dig into it too much, but I'll at least give a brief overview.
Before you continue, I do want to say that a lot of people find this stuff to also be self-evident for themselves and form a confirmation bias, because when they do eat, after they go on these diets and they eat carbohydrates, they tend to get symptoms. Right. But it really depends on what carbohydrates you're eating and how much when you start. So if you have a dysbiosis and then you go and you start eating potatoes again or pasta again, or you start eating certain fruits again that can irritate your gut, or that have fibers that reach the colon that can cause issues, and then you start getting symptoms, the question is really, what carb sources are you eating? And when I talk to people and they're telling me they're having issues with carbs and things like that, the first thing I always ask is, what carb source are you eating? Because people say, oh, I'm only eating pasta. And then they start to get issues with it. And then it's like, okay. And then, oh, I'm eating whole grain bread, or I'm eating this or I'm eating that. And they start to get symptoms, or they start to get weight gain. And then they start to wonder, oh, so maybe it is just the carbs. But there's other things in the food besides carbs. There's different types of carbs. There's fermentable carbohydrates that we can't digest. So it really is important to ask, what carbs are you using? And when we talked about later, when you're starting to transition off a carnivore diet, using the right carbs to start, especially if you went into the diet with some sort of autoimmune disease or gut dysbiosis, it's important to use ones that aren't reaching the colon to start. while you're trying to build things and get things going in the right direction.